Hello, everyone. Good evening and good afternoon. Welcome to EMEA's learning session. My name is Bayarma. I'm a CEO of the Mongolian Evaluation Association and today's moderator. First of all, thank you for joining EMEA's learning session on the complex world of development evaluation, the second of 4 planning sessions on applying complexity framework to the evaluation programs to combat gender-based violence. Lessons for Mongolia. First, please allow me to briefly introduce MEA to those who have no information. The Mongolian Evaluation Association envisions a future where evaluation is professionalized and institutionalized at the national level. The MEA is dedicated to advancing the field of evaluation in Mongolia by developing and implementing scientific evaluation methods and development policies and programs. Additionally, the association focuses on enhancing the capacity of Mongolian evaluators, including young and emerging professionals, and raising awareness about the value of evaluation. Today's session will focus on how to apply complexity framework to evaluate programs to combat gender-based violence. We have 3 great speakers. Let me introduce our speakers briefly. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Bamberger. He has a PhD in sociology from the London School of Economics. Following 10 years of working with NGOs on urban community development in Latin America, he worked for 20 years with the World Bank on gender and development, urban development, and coordinating evaluation capacity development in Africa and Asia. Since retiring from the World Bank, he has consulted on development evaluation with UN agencies and development banks, bilateral development agencies, and NGOs. He's currently a senior research fellow at the International Initiative on Impact Evaluation and advisor on evaluation to the Independent Evaluation Office of the United Nations Development Program and Internal Oversight Office of the Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Today, he will present how the complexity evaluation framework described in session 1 could be applied to the evaluation of a 10-year program to combat gender-based violence in El Salvador. The second speaker is Ms. Enkhbayar Tumur-Ulzii. She is a head of Secretariat and Secretary of the National Committee of Gender Equality, where she leads institutional mechanisms to accelerate gender equality and gender mainstream in national economic and social development. And sector development policies. She has been playing critical role in implementing laws, policies, programs, and recommendations by international organizations on ensuring gender equality. Ms. Enkhbayar has a bachelor degree in international law and master's degree in public administration, and has been working on gender equality, international law, and public administration and management issues in Mongolia for over 15 years. Today, she will introduce a national program to promote gender equality from 2017 to 2021 and how to implement comprehensive systematic preventive action and combat gender-based violence and discrimination. So our last speaker, Dr. Raymond Gervais, after the long period of intensive academic training, business administration of Montreal University and Master of Administration, University of Birmingham, and Master of Science, University of Montreal, and PhD, University of Paris, as well as postdoctoral research in Paris. Dr. Raymond Gervais began 35 years of work as a consultant in the multiple fields and sectors for 1,000 multilateral and bilateral organizations, from planning to monitoring education, health, and infrastructure. He then developed expertise in evaluation, participating in our leading teams mandated to evaluate in a very broad spectrum of sectors and countries. In recent years, he has moved to volunteer work on humanitarian interventions like earthquake and epidemic, especially during the pandemic in his home country, Canada. Since 2018, he has invested in mandates with the Global Affairs Canada funded Mongolia, enhancing resource management through institutional transformation program, as you know, MERIT. And today he will present diagnostic of the current gender-based violence situation in Mongolia and how future gender-based violence prevention programs could be evaluated using complexity lens. All right, before the presentation starts, the participants, if you have questions, comments, or feedback, let us know using the chat. The questions and feedbacks are always welcomed. Let's get it started. Dr. Michael Bamberger, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So greetings, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. And I'm going to be introducing the session by talking about how complexity was used to evaluate a program to combat gender-based violence in El Salvador in Central America. So next slide, please. And the next. So I'd like to begin just by briefly reminding us of what it was we discussed in the first session last month. We introduced, next slide, please. So we introduced the concept of complexity and discussed why complexity is important. And we presented some initial ideas for a five-step methodology for evaluating complex programs, which I'll be illustrating in the session today. And then we had a case study discussing the evaluation of a set of complex Mongolian social protection programs responding to COVID-19, which gave an example of a very complex program in Mongolia. So that's what we talked about last time. So next, please. So today I'm going to be giving an example of how complexity analysis was applied to a 10-year program in El Salvador to combat violence against women. So next, please. So what do we mean by gender-based violence? The European Commission gave a definition that's saying violence directed against a person because of that person's gender, or violence that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately. The gender-based violence may occur in the home. It's often referred to as domestic violence. It may occur in public places or in organizational settings such as schools and work. So this is just one of the definitions of gender-based violence. So next, please. So now I'm going to talk about the case, the evaluation in El Salvador of a gender-based violence program. We use the letters GBV. So this was a 10-year program organized by Oxfam USA. And they started with the premise that GBV has multiple causes relating, in the case of El Salvador, to the high levels of violence following the Civil War, historical, economic, and socio-cultural factors, the cultural tolerance of gender-based violence. A lot of people accept that this is natural and isn't necessarily a problem. And then the failure to address gender-based violence in schools and also in the police. And so the program was built around four main strategies of building alliances between government agencies, municipalities, civil society, and the civil and community development organizations, as well as community groups. There was a focus on raising awareness about gender-based violence in schools, in the community, and in society. So awareness raising was a critical component. And then there was training and on how to use effectively the mass media, radio and newspapers, television, and then technical support to the police, because the police is where women would go to if they had a complaint about gender-based violence. So these were the four main program areas, the main strategies. So this is an example of one of the awareness raising programs, a demonstration in the streets. No more violence against women, no más violencia contra la mujer. So this is just one of the many kinds of awareness raising strategies which we used. So next, please. So the evaluation was asked to address three main questions by the government and the other participating agencies. How effective were the interventions in promoting sustainable change at the local, municipal and national level? So what effect did the programs have? And importantly, how long did it take to achieve different outcomes and impacts? And which outcomes were and were not sustainable over time? This is very important because many programs have an initial impact, but it gets lost. So they wanted to know whether the different kind of impacts were sustainable. So next, please. So most of the evaluation methods I'm going to be describing were actually used in the evaluation in El Salvador, but the 5-step methodology was not used because it hadn't been developed yet. So just to remember that was the one element of the evaluation I'll be talking about, which wasn't used, and so I'm just illustrating how it could have been used. In fact, Oxfam has used this methodology since then. In 2019, for example, they used it to evaluate a program to combat gender-based violence in Lebanon. So next, please. So this is the 5-step complexity evaluation framework. Complexity has many different dimensions, and so you break down the programs which you're working with into a number of separate components so that you can try to evaluate individually each of the components. It's very difficult to evaluate the whole program all at once, so we break it down into a series of components, each of which can be evaluated separately. And then in step 3, we select among all of the different evaluation approaches which are used in the evaluation profession to select which is the best method for evaluating each component, and I'll be giving examples of the methods. And then the big challenge is how to reassemble all of the findings of the different components to assess what the overall program impact was. This is very important because there are many programs where each individual component is evaluated as having been successful, but overall, the program might not be making a significant impact, for example, on the levels of gender-based violence. So this is the really crucial step 4, reassembling all of the different components to see what the overall impact of the program was in the context in which it was working. And then finally, you can ask about what were the contributions of the program to broader development goals, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the 5 stages, and throughout, we can use a theory of change or another theory-based model to a model of how the program is supposed to be implemented, and then we can compare what was supposed to happen with what actually happened on the ground. So the theory of change is a very important component of the strategy. So next, please. So the first step is understanding the nature of complexity. Can you go back one slide, please? Sorry, one more. Okay. There's supposed to be a circle there which hasn't come through. So in the middle, there are the 4 elements of the program which we're looking at. The nature of the intervention, what was this complex, what were the kind of challenges it was facing, then the organizational system in which the program operates, understanding the relationships between the different stakeholders, the different organizations involved. Thank you, that's come through now. And so the program is operating within a broad system. So outside we see all of the different factors in the environment which can be affecting the program. The ones in red are the ones which were particularly important in El Salvador. The political context had a big influence on the program. The economic context of very high levels of unemployment, the socio-cultural traditions, how people thought about gender-based violence, the historical traditions, the organizational relationships and gender relations. So all of these things had a critical influence on the program. So even if the program itself was relatively well organized and implemented, the outcomes are affected very much by all of these external factors. For example, if there's a change in the mayor in the municipality, this might affect significantly how the program is being implemented. So this is the complexity map. So next, please. Then we use, as we discussed last time, a complexity checklist. This has 4 dimensions. This is just the example of how the checklist is used to assess the program itself, how complex it was. And so on the left-hand side, there are 10 indicators of different aspects of the program where the objectives clearly defined, the nature of the problems, were they very difficult to understand or were they well understood? Going down the list, the technical complexity of the program, the social complexity. These are all factors which can affect the complexity of the program. And for each of these indicators, we have a checklist with a score of 1 to 5. If complexity was low, the score would be 1. If it was very high, it would be 5. So you can add up these different indicators to get an estimate of whether this component was considered fairly complex or not very complex or a very high level of complexity. So this gives us an understanding of the nature of complexity. There's one of these pages of the checklist for each of the dimensions. So there's another one, which I'm not showing now, but which I shared last time, on the organizational complexity, the relationships between the different participating agencies. The third dimension is looking at the complexity in the external system. And then the fourth one is understanding the processes of change. Were they simple and fairly linear, or were changes very complex as they were in this case? So next, please. So those are the tools which we use for trying to assess complexity. And so then we ask the question, why was the program considered complex? And the intervention itself was complex with the multiple interacting components at the national, municipal, and local level. So the program itself was complex. The interactions among the multiple stakeholders were also complicated. As you can see on the right, there were at least 7 different organizations involved. The funding agencies, the legislature, ministries, mass media, educational authorities, the police, communities. So all of these were interacting in a very complex way. So some of them coordinating well, some of them in competition. So the interactions were also complex. Then there's a very complex historical and socio-cultural context. There's a high level of acceptance of gender-based violence, the aftermath of the Civil War, which raised the general level of violence in the country, high levels of unemployment and high levels of internal displacement of the population. So all of these factors made the program, the context very, very complex. And then finally, the processes of change. Some programs, you have an intervention and then you can fairly easily see what the outputs and the outcomes were in a fairly linear way. But with a program on something like gender-based violence, it's very complicated. You experiment with a number of different kinds of interventions. Some of them work, some of them run into barriers, some of them work initially, and then you get, for example, if women income goes up because of a microcredit program, you can get resentment and pushback from men and from other groups in the community. So some of the initial successes may get lost, and then you have to try and change the direction that you're going in. So the process of change is non-linear, which again makes it complex. So we can see these are 4 aspects of why we think the program is complex. So next, please. So the second step is we have a program with a number of different components, and how are we going to select the components which we can evaluate? So next, please. So the program had components at the local level, empowerment of training for women leaders. At the municipal level, technical support to the police, the school curriculum to focus on gender awareness, promoting coverage of the gender-based violence in the local media, and promoting administrative reform. And then the national level, the program was promoting new legislation to address GBV and promoting coverage of GBV in the national media. So these are the different components of the program, and we try to address all of these in evaluation. So the third step is selecting the evaluation design for the different project components. So next, please. So we used a multi-method design, which combined, and I'd be happy to talk about these during the discussion time, combined 6 different methodologies, comparative case studies of different municipalities, secondary data reports from funding agencies, from government agencies, surveys. There was samples taken of women community leaders at different points over the 10 years to observe the changes. Key informants, the community leaders, municipal authorities, government ministries, representatives of the police, community leaders. So a range of detailed interviews were conducted. Then advocacy analysis, assessing the effectiveness of the mass media and the other kinds of awareness raising campaigns. And then finally, tracing the progress of legislation, which was one of the ultimate goals, to get new laws put in place and new administrative rules at the municipal level. So we tracked the process of the legislation to see whether the mass media campaigns, for example, were they actually effective in encouraging the government to put into place new legislation. So these were the techniques which we used. Next, please. And one of the challenges always was that the different components had different time trajectories. The technical support to the police, you could see some changes within maybe 1 year. The school changing the curriculum to make their children gender aware might take several years before you could measure changes. The legislative reform, the new laws, could take even longer. It's a very slow process. And then empowering women's leaders can take many years before you see the results. So one of the challenges is that the different components of the program were producing results at different periods of time, and all of these interacted with each other. So you have to really think about the timing of your different evaluations. So next, please. So steps 4 and 5 involve reassembling the different components to assess the project impacts in a complex environment. So next, please. So there were 6 sets of issues were addressed at this level: the interactions among the different project components, the influence of external factors, the civil war, unemployment, and so on, emergence, which we talked about last week, the fact that the program is constantly changing. So after 3 years, the program is quite different than it was at the beginning. So you have to be able to monitor the changes in the program and not just assuming you're monitoring, assessing the program as it was at the beginning. And then the interactions among the different time trajectories of the different components is a big challenge. For example, if it takes longer to bring about changes in how the police deal with cases of gender-based violence, this can slow down other components. For example, the government may not have an incentive to put in place new laws if it isn't clear that the programs with the police are working. So you have to study the interactions among the different time trajectories. Then the program is being implemented by humans who operate in different ways in different contexts. So you have to understand how the program is actually implemented and not just look at what was written down on paper. And then understanding how the organizational structures, the relationships between the police and the municipality, the community, and so on, how these affect project implementation. So these were some of the challenges for when you bring together the different components to see what the overall impact was. So next, please. So just to recap on the evaluation methods used, these we had a longitudinal studies of different municipalities to study how the program was evolving, and it evolved very differently in different municipalities. Social media analysis, looking at how effective the public awareness campaigns were. Did people's attitudes change? Key informant interviews, which are very critical to understand in depth the perceptions of different groups who were involved in the program. Longitudinal community surveys, where we tracked changes in communities over a 10-year period, change is often very gradual, and you need to track all the different dimensions. Then social network analysis, which is techniques which we could discuss for understanding how relationships between different groups evolve over time. So these were the techniques which were used for trying to reassemble a program and look at its overall impact. So next, please. So finally, how were the evaluation findings used? The program proved to be quite effective. There was some reduction in gender-based violence. The school curriculums were put into place. Some legislation was approved. So the way that the evaluation findings were used included, it helped the managers of the program to understand the complex relationships between advocacy, the mass media campaigns, and policy achievements. How did mass media actually affect the policy decision-making process? Then the municipal case studies gave voice to women at the local level and helped the stakeholders to understand the need for flexibility in how the program is implemented in different contexts. Then the constant feedback from the evaluations helped update the theory of change, making it a powerful management tool. And then finally, the evaluation provided feedback over the short, medium, and long-term goals of the program, which helped the stakeholders to understand how to adapt the program as it was evolving. So this is a brief overview of the methodology which we used in El Salvador, and which we believe could be relevant in Mongolia. So next, please. So this is a reference if you're interested in to get into more detail. So next, please. So thank you very much, and I think we have a few minutes now for any questions, and we'll have more time for questions at the end. But if there's one or two quick questions, I think we have about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Michael. And yeah, participants, if you have a question, please raise your hand, or just simply put your questions on the chat box. I have a very simple one in regards to the secondary data. As a countries like Mongolia, we always face issues in quality data. So did you face any challenges or quality issues on secondary data? If yes, what action did you take?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question. The first challenge with secondary data is some kinds of data are easier to find than others. The government reports are often available. The different funding agencies prepare reports. So there's a temptation to only use the secondary data which is easily available. And so in this case, for example, the police had very inadequate records on how they treated cases of gender-based violence. If a woman came into the police station to complain about her husband's behavior, there was almost no records from the police about how they address these situations. There was very little information from the schools of how they were teaching about gender relations and gender-based violence. So the big danger is to just use the sources of information which are easily available, and often they may have a bias. For example, most government agencies don't like to be too critical of their programs, so they may be emphasizing the things which went well and maybe not so much of the things which didn't go well. So there's a danger that you're getting a biased view. This is certainly the case with the police records. So that's a big challenge. And then any kind of data which you do find, you have to check how reliable it is. Some data was based upon very careful design studies. In other cases, it was based more on impressions. I've been in a lot of situations where the donors were asking agencies which were managing community projects to report on how many women were coming to the meetings and how actively they were participating in the discussions. In some communities, there was a very careful record they kept of how many women attended and how often they spoke. In other communities, the community organizer might be very busy and didn't actually keep a record of how many women were in the meeting. So when he or she has to go and prepare a report 2 or 3 weeks later, they think, and they ask one of their friends, do you remember how many women were in the meeting? So you have 2 reports which report how many women were there. One of them was very carefully based upon facts. Another one was just somebody's memory after 2 or 3 weeks. So assessing the quality of the data is also a challenge. So this is something which I think Raymond might be discussing in his presentation, but it's always a challenge understanding the quality of the data, and particularly what kind of data is not there, what kind of biases might there be. So thank you for a very important question.
Thank you. And we have one participant raise hand, and please unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. I have a question regarding one of the methods you laid out. It's the social network analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, this gender-based violence, especially the domestic violence, is quite private issue. Like I was wondering how the social network analysis is done for the domestic violence cases.
Yes.
It is most unlikely that she or anybody would report about the issues, yes. Right?
Right. Thank you. In most cases, gender-based violence, the social network analysis is not used to collect that kind of sensitive information. You have to use other methods, which we can discuss. But social network analysis is normally used, for example, if there are various community groups, the police, the schools, the representatives of the municipality, if they're all coordinating, working together on a program, what social network analysis does is to track the communications, for example, between the municipality and the police and the community organizations. These might be emails, it might be you interview people to ask about how frequently do you meet with the representatives from the municipality. You use a number of techniques, and so you come up with a diagram where you have all of the different organizations, groups who are involved in the program, and you have arrows showing how frequently different groups interact and do the, if you have the data, are the interactions positive or negative or neutral? And you very often find that there's a very high level of communication between some groups, but for example, it may be that the municipality doesn't have much communication with the police. And so this may be one of the things which you're trying to address in the program. So directly on the levels of gender-based violence, you wouldn't be tracking with social network analysis the level of gender-based violence, but you might be tracking the community leaders who are working on this. How frequently do they communicate with or coordinate with the municipality, with the schools? So it's giving you an idea of the relationships between the different organizations. And you very often find either that some groups don't really talk to some of the others, and that might be something you have to work on in your program. So that's what social network analysis is. Nowadays, with all of the new techniques for big data analysis, if you have permission, you can do quite detailed analysis with looking at email exchanges with all of the organizations working on a program. So this is quite an interesting field. You can also just do it by asking people, for example, asking a woman in the community, if you have a problem with gender-based violence, who would you talk to? And you can put together the arrows to find out who are the people in the community that women would go to if they wanted advice. So you can use it in a more qualitative way, or you can use it on a larger scale quantitatively. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. So it's time to our next presentation. So next speaker is Ms. Enkhbayar Tumur-Ulzii. You can take it away. Thank you.
Миний дуу сонсогдож байна уу?
Сонсогдож байна. Таны
За би ярихаар юу яаж байна тий. Сая орж ирсэн. Манай охин жоох нь хажууд одоо нөгөө чи юмаа үзээд намайг бас манаас утсан байдаг байгаа шүү. Яа энэ код мод гэвсээр сая л гэртээ орчихлоо. За чимгээ орчуулад явчих уу тий.
Харин нэг нөгөө арчуулгын юу нь болдгүй.
Одоо тэгээ яана.
Тэгэхээр яг та яг шууд монголоор ярьчих. Слайд нь англи дээр байгаа учраас би тэгээд энэ хоёр дээр дараа нь цаамар ялгааг хэлчихнэ.
Өө тийм үү. Жаахан тиймэрхүү юм болох юм дээ тэгвэл тий.
Биш нэгээ тохируулсан тэгээд энэ дээр болохоор би шууд орчуулна гэсэн юм гарч ирдгүү тэгээ бүр гайхаад.
Уг нь interpretation гэдээ байж штэ тий. English Russian гэд хоёр сонголт агаад.
Тэгээ надад болохоор би орчуулна гэсэн тэр товч надад байхгүй зүгээр сонсно гэсэн тохируулга нь байгаа байхгүй.
Оо тийм үү. Ямар баларсан юм тий. За би тэгвэл тэгээ монголоор яриад явчих уу.
тэгээ.
За. Миний слайдыг хаанаас гүйж байгаа лээ?
Raymond та тэгэхээр next гэж хэлээд аарай.
За. Аха. За.
Sorry, Raymond, you go to the previous one. Yes.
Okay, next. Thank you so much. Sorry, as I'm speaking the Mongolian language. And gender эрхтгч байдлыг хангах тухай хуулийг хэрэгжүүлэх дунд хугацааны хөтөлбөрийг 2017 онд бид нар бас баталж нийтдээ 5 зорилтын хүрээнд хэрэгжүүлсэн байгаа. Тэгээд энэ хөтөлбөр маань 21 онд хэрэгжиж дуусаж бид нар бас 21 оны сүүл 22 оны бас 1-р улирлыг алгасуулаад ингээд үнэлгээг бол нөгөө үнэлгээг бол хийлгсэн. Тэгээд энэ үнэлгээг бид нар бас хүндлэнгийн одоо судалгааны Монгол үндэсний судалгааны аж ахуйн нэгжээр бас энэ нээлттэй тендер зарлаад энэ үнэлгээг бол хийлгсэн. Тэгээд энэ үнэлгээний үр дүнгээс бас та бүхэнтэй хуваалцуулсандаа баяртай байна. Тэгэхээр өнөөдрийн бол та бүхний хийж байгаа энэ нөгөө хилцүүлэг бас гендер зурсан хүчирхийллийн асуудлаар хийгдэж байгаа учраас манай үндэсний хөтөлбөрийн одоо 5 дугаар зорилт бол энэ гендер зурсан одоо хүчирхийллийн хэрэгжилт бас ямар төвшөнд байсан бэ гэдэг энэ асуудлаар бас та бүхэнд мэдээлэл танилцуулахаар байгаамаа. За next slide. Энэ слайд бол ингээд та бүхэнд харагдаж байгаа. Тэгэхээр 5 дугаар зорилт нь бол яг ингээд шийдвэр одоо яг гендрийн одоо гендерт сурсан хүчирхийллээс урьдчилсан сэргийлэх. За үүнийг бас даван туулахад олон нийтийн ойлголт мэдлэгийг нэмэгдүүлэх чиглэл бас илүүтэйгээр гендрийн үндэсний хороо анхаарч ажилласан. Мэдээж хүчирхийлэл гарсны дараах үйл явцад бол гэр бүлийн одоо тодорхой хуулиуд дээр нь одоо холбогдох байгууллагууд үүрэг хүлээгээд ажилладаг. Манай байгууллагын тухайд бол яг урьдчилсан сэргийлэх буюу олон нийтийн гендерийн хвшмэл ойлголтыг арилгах замаар энэ гендер зурсан хүчирхийлэл буюу ялгарлан гадуурхалтыг нийгэмд одоо бууруулахад бол үр хувь нэмрээ оруулж ирсэн байгаа. За next slide. Нийт энэ манай үндэсний бас хөтөлбөрийн хэрэгжилт үндэсний хэмжээ 80.4% хэрэгжсэн. Тэгээ яг энэ хүчирхийллээс урьдчилсан сэргийлэх зорилтоос ингэж нэлээд ийм өндөр хувьтай хэрэгжилтийг бас хангаж ажилласныг бас ингээд дуртахад таатай байна. За ер нь бол дэд зорилт бол 5-ын одоо хүрээнд бол бид нар одоо 4-5 ажил бол ингэж тавьсан. Тэгээд энэ дээр бол 4 одоо дэд зорилт бол маш тодорхой бас юм үр дүнд хүрсэн гэж бол харагддаг. Тэгээд нэг дэд зорилтын хүрээнд бас ингээд тодорхой бас ажлууд бол хязгаарлагдмал бол төвшөнд бол хийгдсэн байгааг бол бас хэлхэн зүйтэй байхаа гэж бодож байна. За next slide. За гендрийн 5 дугаар зорилтын 1-р одоо хамгийн гол зорилт бол sexual harassment байгаа. Тэгэхээр нөгөө ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтыг бол бид нар гендер зурсан хүчирхийллийн маш нэг том одоо төрөл байгаа. За яг албан ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтын асуудлыг бол Монгол улс бол 2011 он гендерийн эрхтгч байдлыг хангах тухай хуулийн хөдөлмөрийн харилцаанд гендерийн эрхтгч байдлын баталгаа хангах гэдэг энэ хэсэгт бол ажил олгогчийн зүгээс ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтыг сурчсан сэргийлэх ямар зохицуулалтыг хийх ёстой юм. Ажилтан ямар энэ асуудлыг анхаарах гэдэг энэ зохицуултыг бол маш тодорхой хуулинд заасан гэсэн гэвчиг одоо бид нар энэ хөдөлмөрийн харилцаа зохицуулж байгаа үндсэн одоо хууль болон хөдөлмөрийн тухай хуулинд бол энэ асуудлыг гендерийн хууль батлагдсанаас хойш нэг ч одоо энэ зохицуултыг оруулаагүй байсан. Тэгээд сая 2021 онд бид нар хөдөлмөрийн тухай хуулийн шинжилсэн найруулгыг маш олон удаа нэмэлт өөрчлөлт хийсний дараагаар 21 онд одоо анх удаа бид нар шинжилсэн найруулгыг батлахдаа ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамт буюу олон улсад энэ 190-р конвенц бол батлагдсан шүү дээ. Олон улсын хөдөлмөрийн байгууллагаас. Тэгэхээр энэ конвенцийн хүрээнд батлагдсан бүхэл үзэл баримтлалыг бас энэ хөдөлмөрийн тухай хуулийн шинжилсэн найруулгад оруулж чадсан нь бол маш том одоо ахиц буюу гендерийн хуулийн хэрэгжилтийг дэмжсэн буюу гендерийн мэдрэмжтэй ийм хууль болж чадсан. Тэгэхээр ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтыг ер нь яг урьдчилан сэргийлэх аж ахуйн нэгж байгууллага болоо төрийн байгууллагуудад бид нар ямар арга хэмжээ авах, эндээс яаж урьдчилан сэргийлэхийг хэрэг гарах юм бол одоо тухайлбал энэ хүний тухайн хувь хүний нууцыг хамгаалах замаар бид нар яаж бас энэ давхар энэ асуудлаас урьдчилан сэргийлж чадах юм бэ? Энд дээр бас арга зүйн зөвлөмж өгөөч гэдэг хүсэлтүүд бол айгүйх гендерийн хорооны ажлын албанд ирдэг. Тэгээ бид нар энэ дээр бол энэ арга зүйн зөвлөмж бол боловсруулсан. За энэний дараагаар бас энэ хүний эрхийн үндэсний хөдөлмөр нийгэм хамгааллын яамнаас хамтраад 21 онд хуульд нийцүүлээд бас ийм үндэсний хэмжээний одоо ийм журам боловсруулж бол бүх түвшинд ингээ мөрдүүлэх бол ажил бол амжилттай хийгдсэн. Тэгэхээр энэ ажлыг өнөөдөр ямар ч гэсэн өмчлөөс үл хамааран бүхэл байгууллагууд хөдөлмөрийн дотоод журамдаа оруулж байгаа нь айгүй юм давуу талтай. Тэгэхээр ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтын хамгийн аимшигтай нэг асуудал нь бол давхар дарамтанд орох асуудал байдаг. Өөрөөр хэлбэл ажлын байран дээрээ дарамтанд орсон эрэгтэй эмэгтэйч буцаад гэр бүлдээ ирээд давхар юм дарамтанд орж за энэ нь бүр ингээд ажил хөдөлмөр эрхлэхээс гадна бүр гэр бүлийн асуудал руу хүртэл орж ирдэг учраас их хор өрнүүлэн айгүй юм асар том цар хүрээтэй байдаг. Тийм учраас энийг одоо үндэсний хэмжээнд бид нар ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтгүй одоо болох бүх байгууллагууд энийг дотоод журмаараа хязгаарлаж хаах энэ соёлыг түгэх гэдэг ажлыг бол бас энэ үндэсний одоо хөтөлбөр батлагдах 5 дугаар зорилтын түвшинд бол нэлээд сайн хийж чадсны түвшинд бодлого хэрэгцээ орчны хувьд бол шийдвэр гаргах түвшинд хүртэл энэ асуудлыг бол нэг дуугаар одоо хүлээн зөвшөөрч энэ хууль хэрэгцээ орчин хүртэл баталгаажиж гарсан маш том одоо ахиц болсон гэдгийг хэлмээр байна. За next slide. За дараагийнх нь нэг ажил бол бид нар энэ олон улсын одоо үндэсний хэмжээнд бол аяныг бол бид нар маш амжилттай хийж чадсан. Өөрөөр хэлбэл хууль батлагдаад 2017 оноос эхлээд бол хөтөлбөр батлагдаад 17 оноос эхлээд бид нар сүүлийн 21 оныг дуустал бол яг энэ гендер зурсан хүчирхийлэлтэй тэмцэх 16 хоногийн аян гэж ирдэг те 16 champion gender based violence гэж 16 days гэдэг. Тэгэхээр энийг нөгөө бид нар олон улсын аяныг Монгол улсад өрнүүл яг хүний эрхийн өдрийг ухцсан энэ аяныг бид нар амжилттай хийхийн одоо хүрээнд нэгдсэн үндэсний байгууллагын хүн амын сан Швейцарын хөгжлийн агентлагийн дэмжлэгтэйгээр одоо хэрэгжсэн 6 жилийн хугацаанд одоо бид нар яг энэ цэлийн хаалтыг хийх гэж нийтдээ Secretariat байгууллагууд орсон одоо 6 жилийн хугацаанд хэрэгжээд дуусж байгаа. Энэ төслийн хүрээнд болоод бид нар тасралтгүй одоо энэ гэр бүлийн хүчирхийлэлтэй тэмцэх асуудлыг хууль эрх зүйн орчинд энэ гэмт хэрэг болгож одоо хуульчилсан цаг хугацаа энэний дараагаар үндэсний хэмжээний чадвар бөхжүүл хамтарсан баг энтер гэдэг ингээ бүх энэ тогтолцооныхын түвшинд бол бид нар маш том ахицаа гаргасан. Тэгэхээр энэ хүрээнд бидний хамгийн том 2 том зорилт 3 том зорилт байсан. Нэгдүгээр бид нар хууль эрх зүйн орчныг шинжилэл, хоёрдугаарт нь тогтолцоо бэхжүүлэх хамгийн том ажил бол энэ урьдчилан сэргийлэх буюу кампайн те ерөөсөө яаж энэ нөгөө нэг олон нийтийн ойлголт мэдлэгийг нэмэгдүүлэх вэ гэдэг. Тэгээ мэдээч энэ дээр бид нар одоо төрийн холбогдох байгууллагуудтай хамтраад бид нар нийтдээ 42,000 одоо энэ дээр тоонууд та бүхэнд харж байгаа байх. Тэгээд нийтдээ бид нар бараг 5 сая орчим одоо хүмүүст яг энэ тоогоор энэ мэдээллүүдийг одоо удаа дараага 4 жилийн хугацаанд бид нар жил болгон 80-ны хүрээнд мөн олон улсын эмэгтэйчүүдийн эрхийг хамгаалах өдрийг бас бид нар энэ гендер зурсан хүчирхийллээс ангид байх эмэгтэйчүүдийн хүндэгдэж байгаа эрхийн асуудлын хүрээнд гээд жилд ингээс 2-оос 3 80-ны хүрээнд бол энэ асуудлыг бол олон нийтэд одоо гаргаж тавьж нийтдээ бүхий л одоо сувг те сошиал нийгмийн сувгуудаар болоод телевиз, сайт, сонингууд гээд хэвлэл мэдээллийн бүхий л байгууллагуудтай хамтарч маш амжилттай бас энэ олон нийтийн ойлголт мэдлэгийг нэмэгдүүлж чадсны үр дүнд гэр бүлийн хүчирхийлэл одоо ерөнхийдөө хаалттай хаалганы цаана үлдэгддэг гэмт хэргийн тоо нэмэгдэх тусам нөө илрүүлэлт өөрөө сайжирч эхэлсэн. Тэгээд энэ дээр бас нийгэм айдаг энэ бол үнэхээр одоо болохгүй үйлдэл юм а гэдэг дээр бол хүлээн зөвшөөрсөн ийм акцууд бол гарсан байгааг бас хэлмээр байна. За next slide. За мэдээж энэ бол нөгөө өмнө нь миний ярьсан сэдэв байна тий ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамттай холбоотой хууль эрх зүйн орчны хүрээнд бол би нөгөө эхний слайдтай хамт ярьсан. Тэгэхээр энэ дээр бол яг хамгийн гол нь бид нар энэ дээр нэг гол тоцсогсон зүйл нь юу байгаа бэ гэхээр ерөөсөө нөгөө аж ахуй нэгж байгууллагын хөдөлмөрийн дотоод журам тусгах асуудлыг бол бид нар аюул сайн амжилттай хийж байгаа. Тэгэхээр Монголын үйлдвэрчний эвлэл ажил олгогч эзэдийн холбоо Монголын худалдан аж үйлдвэрийн танхим бол гендерийн үндэсний хороо нэг шүүн байгууллага байдаг. Тэгэхээр энэ ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамт яг энэ дээр сая бид нар 2022 оны 12 сарын 22-ны хойно хөдөлмөр нийгэм хамгааллын яам ажил олгогч эзэдийн үндэсний холбоо тэгээд үйлдвэрчний ил буюу хөдөлмөрийн 3 талт зөвшөлтслөөр гендерийн мэдрэмжтэй ажлын байрны бодлогын баримтчиг батлагдсан. Тэгээд энэ бодлогын баримтчийг бид нар сая 23 оны 1-р сараас эхлээ сая орон нутагт танилцуулах болоод үндэсний хэмжээнд танилцуулах ажлууд явж байгаа. Тэгэхээр энэ ажил дээр бол бид нар яг энэ асуудлуудыг одоо тухайлан оруулж гендерийн мэдрэмжтэй ажлын байр гэж юу хэлээд байгаа. Энэ нь нөгөө ажлын байрны бэлгийн дарамтаас яаж ангид байх юм гэдгийг нэлээд одоо нөгөө аж ахуй нэгж байгууллагад деталь танилцуулах чадвар бэхжүүлэх сургалтаар тасралтгүй бол хийгдэж байгаа гэдгийг хэлмээр байна. Next slide. За энэ хэсэг бол нөгөө 5.5 заасан үндэсний хөтөлбөрийн хүрээнд одоо тусгагдсан. Бид нар 2020 оны жилийн эцсийн байдлаар бол 17 нь одоо one stop shop буюу нэг цэгийн үйлчилгээний төв. За 24 одоо хамгаалах байр бол үндэсний түвшинд бол ажиллаж байгаа. Тэгэхээр энэ үйл ажиллагаа маань 2000 одоо гэр бүлийн хүчирхийлэлтэд тэмцэх тухай хууль батлагдсанаас хойш олон улсын байгууллагын төсөл дэмжлэгтэйгээс гадна Монгол улсын засгийн газар одоо хуулийн эрхчлэлтийг дэмжиж бид нар хүчирхийлэлд өртсөн хохирогчийг хамгаалах нэгцгийн үйлчлэгээний төвийг одоо аймаг нийслэлд дүүрэгт одоо байгуулах. За энэ төвийг бол хуулинд олон цагдаа, эмнэлэг, за гэр бүл хүүхд залуучууд хөгжлийн газрыг түшиглээд аль нэг байгууллагыг одоо түшиглээд ийм боломжийг нь бол нийтдээ тавьж өгсөн. Тэгэхээр өнөөдөр үндэсний хэмжээнд нийтдээ одоо ингээд 41 нэм төвд болол 20 оны байдлаар бол ингээд ажил одоо байгуулагдаад ажиллаж байгаа. Нөгөө 21 онд хийсэн үнэлгээ учраас тэгж харагдаж байгаах та бүхэн. За мөн одоо бид нар энэ төр хамгаалах байрлуулах үйлчилгээний нэг хүнд одоо ногдох хувьсах зардлыг одоо баталж өгөөд энэ нөгөө халамжийн нөгөө сангаас гарч байгаа. Тэгэхээр өөрөөр хэлбэл тухайн нөгөө байгуулсан хэдээч нөгөө үйлчилгээ хүргэх асуудал айгүй чухал. Тэгэхээр Монгол улсын хэмжээнд гендерийн үндэсний хорооноос нэгцгийн үйлчилгээний төв дээр бол нэг төвийг бол бид нар сайн туршлага болгож үндэсний хэмжээнд зарласан байдаг. Тэгээ энэ нь бол Баянгар аймгийн нэгцгийн үйлчилгээний төв байдаг. Яагаад нэгцгээ тэр сайн туршлага гэж байгаа вэ гэхээр нөгөө нэг аж ахуй буюу одоо байгууллагын хувьсах зардал тухайн хүний нөөцийн цалин ч юм уу энэ асуудлыг төр гаргах ёстой тийм энэ чинь нөгөө төр үйлчлэгээ өргөж байгаа учраас хамгийн гол нь үйлчилгээ буюу нөгөө хохирогчдод хүргэх үйлчлэгийг бид нар иргэний нийгмийн байгууллагаар хүргэх нь бол хамгийн нөгөө нэг шилдэг практик юм а гэдгийг бол энийг яг одоо тэр утгаар ажиллаж байгаа нь бол Баянгар аймгийн нэгцгийн үйлчлэгээний төв байгаа. Тэгэхээр иргэний нийгмийн байгууллага яг энэ үйлчлэгийг хүргэхээр яг хүчирхийлэлд өртсөн тэр эмэгтэйчүүд тэр хүүхдийг одоо тухайлбал яг олж илрүүш тэднийд яг нөгөө сэтгэл зүйн нөгөө нэг хамтарсан үйлчлэгээнүүдийг яг хүргээд байгаа. Яг төрийн байгууллагын одоо ажилтнууд ингээд яг тэр хохирогчдод нэгцгийн үйлчлэгийг хүргэхээр арай нөгөө нэг арга зүй хувьд юм уу нөгөө мэдрэмжийн хувьд юм уу үйлчлэгийг одоо яг төрийн байгууллагын ажилд нь ажиллаа хийж байгаа учраас одоо яг тэр нөгөө үйл ажиллагааг одоо мэдэрч бас нөгөө ажиллах дээр бас нөгөө арга зүй хувьд бол тутмаг байгаад байгаа. Тэгэхээр энэ дээр бол төрийн бас байгууллага мэрэгсэн төрийн бас байгууллага үйлчлэгээ хүргэх нь бол хамгийн болов сайн туршлага болж байна гэдгийг бас хорооос зарлаж бол дэмжсэн байдаг. За нийтдээ бид нар бас 20 оны байдлаар энэ зарцуулсан төсвийн дүн бас та бүхэнд харагдаж байгаа байх. За мөн бас тоонууд ингээ харагдаж байгаа байх. Ер нь бол нэгцгийн үйлчлэгээний төв, хохирогчийг хамгаалах байранд үйлчлүүлээ гарч байгаа эмэгтэйчүүд, хүүхдүүдийн гэр бүлд нь иргэн нэгтгэх ажлууд бол бас нэлээд удаан хугацаанд бол хийгддэг. Тэгэхээр ер нь бол бид нар нөгөө 2-3 ангилал бий болгоод байгаа шүү дээ. Ер нь бол ингээ хүчирхийлэл нэгэнт одоо үйлдэх нь тодорхой, тэрнээс ингээд тэр асуудлыг ингээд эргүүлэн хандлага зан үйлийн өөрчлөлтийг хийхэд бол асар их хугацаа орж байгаа. Тэр одоо хүчирхийл үйлдэгчтэй бол бид нар алуудан сургалтаар бол явж байгаа шүү дээ. Алуудан сургалтуудыг хийж байгаа. Харин одоо юу гэдэг нэг удаагийн 2 удаагийн стресс менежментийг хийж чадаагүйгээс үлдэж байгаа нь хүчирхийл үйлдэх эрсдэл бүхий ч юм уу тэр айлуудтай энэ зорилттой айлуудтай бас юм ажиллах тусгаалсан ажлуудыг бол яг нөрчсөн сэргийлэх бодлогоор бол нэлээд сайн ажиллах энэ чиглэл рүү болов чиглүүлэх нь айгүй зүйтэй байгаад байгаа. Тэгэхээр ер нь л бид нар нөгөө хүчирхийлэл одоо үлдэж байгаа тэр зан үйл тэр одоо хамгийн суур шалтгаан болвол ерөөс архитал биш. Тэр суур шалтгаан болвол ерөөсөө нөгөө гэр бүлийн байдал ялгаатай байдал биш. Тэр суур шалтгаан бол ерөөсөө л нөгөө генерийн хөвшмөл буруу ойлголт байгаа. Эрэгтэй хүн юм байх, эмэгтэй хүн юм байх гэсэн. Тэгэхээр энэ хөвшмөл буруу ойлголтыг л бид халах эрэгтэй эмэгтэй хүмүүс биенээ нөгөө энэ тэнцүү үнэлэх асуудал айгүй чухал байгаад байгаа. Дээр нь бас нөгөө эмэгтэйчүүдийн эдийн засгийн оролцоог нэмэгдүүлэх, эдийн засгийн боломжийг нэмэгдүүлэх, орлоготой байх гэдэг асуудлыг давхар бид нар бас шийдэж авах нь айгүй зүйтэй юм а гэсэн энэ бодлогыг бас хорооноос бас салбарын яамдуудтай хамтраад ажиллаж байгаа гэдгийг бас хэлье. За next slide ингээд дуусчих шиг байна те. Тэгээд нийтдээ ингээд гендер зурсан хүчирхийлэл түүнээс урьдчилан сэргийлэх бодлого арга хэмжээний хүрээнд бол ер нь гендрийн үндэсний хорооноос авчиж хэрэгжүүлж байгаа хамгийн том бодлого мэдээж бид нар нөгөө салбарын яам бол биш. Энэ асуудлыг бас хуулиараа өрг хүлээж шийдвэрлэдэг байгууллага бол бас биш. Чиг үүргээрээ тэгэхээр гендрийн үндэсний хорооны хамгийн одоо гол чиг үүрэг бол бид нар тухайн салбар орон нутгийн одоо авч хэрэгжүүлж байгаа бодлого үйл ажиллагаа гендрийн үзэл баримтлалтай байгаа хэсэгт нь гендрийн дүн шинжилгээ хийх. Тэгээд энэ хүрээнд нь мэргэжил арга зүйн зөвлөгөө өгдөг. Тэгээд энэ хүрээндээ хорооны дэргэд бол үндэсний экспертийн бүлгүүд бол шинжээчдийн бүлэг бас ажилладаг. Мөн эрдэмтэн судлаачдын бүлэг бас ажилладаг байна. Тэгэхээр энэ дээр бол бид нэр илүү олон улсын байгууллагуудын техник туршлагын төслийн дэмжлэгтэйгээр салбарын яам орон нутгийн одоо байгууллагуудтай бол нэгт хамтарч бол ажилладаг байгаа. Тэгэхээр гендер зурсан хүчирхийллээс урьдчилан сэргийлэх, гендрийн хөвшмөл ойлголтыг олон нийтийн хөвшмөл ойлголтыг арилгах чиглэлд одоо илүү төлхөө ажиллаж байна. За сүүлийн бол яг энэ хөтөлбөрийн одоо үнэлгээгээр бол бас энэ 5 дугаар зорилт маань нэлээд хэрэгжилт өндөр гарсан нь бидний бол архицол энэ гэр бүлийн хүчирхийлэлтэд тэмцэх дээр нь ажлын байрны бэлгийн тарамт гэсэн яг энэ хоёр одоо гендер зурсан хүчирхийллийн энэ хоёр том хэлбэр төрөлтэй болвол маш одоо ахиц зол гарсан нь бол дагаврын энэ хуулийн үндэсний хөтөлбөрийн хэрэгжилтийн үнэлгээгээр бол гарч ирсэн гэдгийг бас хэлмээр байна. Ингээд миний илтгэл дуусч байна. Баярлалаа.
За баярлалаа. Юуны түрүүнд танд болон танай баг хамт олонд баярлалаа гэж хэлмээр байна. Энэ богино хугацаанд ийм олон хүнд хүрээд нэм дөрөвтэй акц гаргасан баяр хүргэе. Тэгээд манай оролцогчдын зүгээс асуулт хэрэг байгаа бол гараа өргөд асуулт асуугаарай.
Та нөгөө нэг одоо бичиж юуч авчаа дараа нь л нөгөө орчуулж хүргэхээс те.
Тийм би тэгэхэд дараад нэг юу хийгээд сешныхаа дараа нэг багийн уулзалт хийхдээ тайлбарлаад хэлчихье. За хэрвээ асуулт байхгүй бол бүгдээрээ дараагийнхын хэлтгэл рүү орцгоё. Thank you, Ms. Enkhbayar. And while it's run out of time, we should move to our next speaker. Well, our final speaker is Dr. Raymond Gervais. Raymond, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not too sure. How much time do we have?
Yeah, we have a good enough time.
Okay. I'm going to try to look at not an evaluation of a program that still is in the making in Mongolia, but how gender-based, how the complex analysis can allow Mongolians to understand how in implementing, but also in evaluation, taking into consideration the complexity brings more light into the problems and the challenges faced in implementing and evaluating. So what we know, let me see. Okay, now we know who I am. Okay, first, in the introduction, what I would like to say is that we have a clear understanding, because there is a great number of documents and reports already that exist on gender-based violence in Mongolia. And there are many stakeholders, including multilateral like UNFPA, who are now heavily involved and have been since 2017 in GBV in Mongolia. Now, the challenges that are specific to the Mongolian, in good part to the Mongolian experience in all of its activities, but especially in GBV, mitigating the effects of GDB, is the fact that in most cases, projects and what are called programs are really based on activities. And therefore that activity basis, that activity focus has been a great challenge in trying to organize a more coherent and structured reaction to some of the problems in Mongolia. So that would kind of, for me, be an example of how in Mongolia there are still preliminary steps that have to be taken to really tackle the issue of gender-based violence. Nevertheless, as we will see in the following screens, we do have interesting and sometimes data that has questions to it that we won't be able to go into great detail. Now, the first, the demographics of GBV in Mongolia has been underlined and described and measured in the 2017 Breaking the Silence. Well, you know of that report anyway. Breaking the Silence for Equality. And it is, in fact, a random multi-stage sample survey of all 21 AMAGs. And in the end, 7,220 women were interviewed, were surveyed. Now, this is really, there's a great, a whole slew of graphics and tables in the report itself. So, please go back to the report. I've isolated one because one is really quite interesting. The percentage of women in Mongolia who experience, and I'm going to ask a question, I'm not expecting an answer, but start thinking of what problem is there on this graph? Do you see a problem on this graph in terms of how the data is structured? Think about it for 3 seconds, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now, the problem here is how do we explain that the cohorts of women here of the 45 and more have lower lifetime experiences of gender-based violence? And here you have what I would consider as being the first step towards a complex issue, because to be able to answer that question, you have to go into so many different perspectives and possible hypotheses on the effects of generations, the effects of, and I'll go back to it, rural-urban migration, effects of differences in how different generations look at, and some of the effects of the migrations on the younger, which may not have affected the older generations. So think about it and see how it can be complex and how complex it could be to try to understand that. And how would you organize a way of getting valid information and data on some of the explanations about this issue? Okay, so the mapping of GBV doesn't really give us a clear, very perspective on differences, except that we probably could say that in the West, here, the percentages are lower. The national average is 31.2% of women have experienced GBV. In fact, if you look at the and take into account the margins of error, most of the AMAGs are around that national average. Now, the few AMAGs, this one in particular, I won't be able, well, Dakan AMAG, Govi-Sumber AMAG, and Ungovi AMAGs are way above. The red is for above and the green is for lower, are over. And there you go. You do then, if there is no real pattern in the dissemination, the dispersion of these percentages, you still have discrepancies, and then you would have to put together a methodology to understand where these discrepancies come from. What are the underlying social, historical, cultural differences or explanations that would allow us to understand about these discrepancies, okay? At the international level, Mongolia would be classified as being kind of middle. If you look at the red little boxes here, the red indications, you have the countries that have higher than Mongolia percentages of violence. Now, this seems to be very fluid, very, you know, interesting, but in the end, think about it. In international comparison, the big challenge is the fact that there are differences in semantics, there are differences in methodologies, there are differences in how the data was gathered. And so what we can say about Mongolia is the fact that it is lower than these countries, and especially lower than some of the islands in all of the islands, actually, in that region, the Asian, what's it called, the Asian Pacific region. Okay. Going back to Michael's, I try to, and this is what I'm going to do very, very quickly in the next few screens so we have a chance to discuss it. I've tried to look at all of these components from the complexity map, with the exception of environment, which I pulled out because I failed to see any environmental components in trying to analyze GBV in Mongolia. So if we go into that first set of components of the Mongolia map, politically speaking, in Mongolia, what really comes out when you look through the GBV topic, you see that there is, and our colleague probably mentioned it, though I didn't have a chance to understand everything, but our colleague before mentioned that there are a lot of national stakeholders, a lot of international stakeholders. The issue that comes out in the few assessments of the state of GBV actions in Mongolia is one of coordination, which goes back to Michael's point when talking about El Salvador. What also comes out is the fact that from certain assessments, and we'd have to validate that on the longer term than what we know from 2017-18 to now, is how the role of NGOs have been under-evaluated, that the mobilization of NGOs and the coordination between NGOs and national and international stakeholders has been lacking, and therefore that there is an issue that has to be addressed if we are to implement it, but also if we are to understand anything in the future about the evaluation of any of these actions and programs. The second component is really the imbalance between services and budget allocations. There have been, and our colleague just prior to my presentation has underlined the enormous work that has been done in creating one-stop centers, creating shelters. The problem, as in so many countries, including very developed countries like USA, is a difference between the budget allocated and the will to offer these services, which in very many cases don't meet the needs and the demand there to address properly the problem. What happens is that when we look carefully at the state of the sector in Mongolia now, is the fact that there is high turnover of staff at all levels. The basic service delivery, the managers, and the decision making. There's a high turnover. It may be linked to work conditions. It may be linked to all sorts of factors, and it becomes an issue that is in that kind of complexity equation that we're looking at, both from the El Salvador case and the Mongolia case. The legal framework is remarkably well developed in Mongolia. There's a significant legal framework. The problem really is one of organizing the revisions. One very, very recent report underlined the fact that there is a family approach to the analysis of domestic violence, where the specific needs of women in the household are not really covered by the legal framework, or not insufficiently covered by the legal framework. So that emphasizing the fact of approaching it through a family perspective makes relatively invisible the specific needs, the specific conditions of the women of the household, okay? Socio-cultural, I will go back to before the end, if I have 2 minutes, in giving an example. There's a tradition, we talked about it amongst ourselves. There's a tradition of gender prejudice and biases, and the informal and formal education needs adjustments. And I will go back and give a few pointers on this. There is a clear weakness in the law in terms of taking into account the needs of sex workers, lesbians, gays, well, BT, whatever number of letters you want to add to it. These are quite visible portions of the population, and therefore would have to be addressed eventually in the future, or in 10 years' time be evaluated and seen as a weakness of how these programs were implemented. Infrastructure, the network, there is a network of one-stop centers. I won't go back into it. My Mongolian colleague talked about it. The financial upkeep is difficult. The budgets are not there. And what we can see is that there is a need for the expansion of the network, because the demand is much greater than what is offered, what is supplied at this point in time. I'm not going to ask any answers to the questions. I'm just going to ask you to think about these two questions. What aspect, singular mode, what aspect, what important central core aspect, has the most notable negative impact on GBV and GBV actions and projects and programs. And then the second question is, what mitigating strategies would have the greatest effect on GBV reduction? Think about it and see what you would see as, and we could eventually have time to discuss it, hopefully. Finally, on what we have on our complexity map is historical. Historical, there since 1990 has been a remarkable and well-documented prudent transition. That has had very positive effect. The problem that has arisen is the fact that there's been a lot of iterations, a lot of modification, a lot of changes in the laws, in the resolutions, in the projects, in the programs. And therefore, administrations and agencies have been relatively fragile because every 2 or 3 years, something has changed in their organization. Since I've been coming to Mongolia, the Cabinet Secretariat has been structured 2 or 3 times in the last years that I've been in Mongolia. The second historical is the pandemic. And there we have very little. We're starting to get a bit of information about the effects of the pandemic on gender-based violence. We still need more perspective and more information about how this has been an important factor in increasing, most possibly increasing the level of pandemics, which is not at all specific to Mongolia. It's been the case in most countries. Demographics, population movements, rural-urban migrations. This is the most important element in terms of what we saw in that first graph. It may be an important hypothesis to hold to explain why women who were in a rural area 20, 40, 50 years ago may not have been submitted to the same tensions in their households than more younger who are now living in an urban environment. Access to services. An interesting point that was made in one of the reports that I had access to is security in courts. I was kind of struck by the fact that the actions that have been taken to identify gender has not been followed by actions in ensuring the security of women going to court and defending the fact that they had been violently, in whatever shape or form, violently abused by their husbands. Some of the shelters, I don't think all of them, but some of the shelters are managed by police. And that is also seen as a kind of a negative element of the services that are offered, because in fact, in the management of these shelters, the strategy was to impose confinement. And the problem with confinement is that you don't allow women in those shelters to think about and to implement actions that would allow them to improve their autonomy and their capacity to find solutions to their economic and social conditions. And finally, gender relationships. Well, as I've seen in my own experience coming to Mongolia, with the pleasures I've had of coming to Mongolia, there is still a male domination in private. Though what you do, and this is really quite striking in Mongolia, is that you do have equal access to higher level education, in general, and to higher level education. The problem is that having higher education levels that does not, correlate with equal opportunities. And that if we look at GBV in the work environment, it may be related to that disbalance relationship in the workplace. The question here how many aspects would have to be involved in modifying conditions to access to services for services? I'm asking questions. I'm not asking for, I'm just asking you to think about it. How much of these two screens would have to be put together to be able to improve and to allow for access to services for providers. Just very, very briefly, I have 2 minutes. I thought about one example in the socio-cultural component of the map of what would be required, and I'm just asking you to think about it again, is what would be required for one of the elements in our colleagues' presentation about education and understanding. And the core dialectics in this approach to improving understanding education is a relationship between informal education, parental education, and formal education. And here, the most important element is really for parents, for fathers to understand what is GBV, to give the example of not only explaining, but to give example of not, having violent actions towards the mother or the daughters. And therefore, how long would that take to be able to produce a positive outcome on that segment of our structure, of our, let's call it a program? In the formal, really the objective is really a revision of the curriculum and an inclusion of more gender-based violence and gender relationship. Now, it may not be an exhaustive list of stakeholders, but look at the list of stakeholders and see how many people would have to be involved for such a program to be planned and implemented. And this is where we go back to Mike's table, the nature of the intervention. If we were to imagine a program, a 10-year program comparable to El Salvador, on the specific topic of improving understanding and education of gender relationships and gender-based violence, how would this program be classified? These are some of the reports that are important for the understanding in Mongolia. I won't comment on them, and I will thank you for your time and patience.
Thank you, Raymond. It was mind-blowing. I still the first slide on my mind, that the graph. I can't believe it. I thought the GBV is actually reduced through the new generation, but the graph was totally different. So yeah, participants, if you have a question, just raise your hand and ask your question.
Let me just add that what we would expect had GBV been linear in its development in Mongolia, we would expect the timeline of older generations to be higher than the ones of gender generation, because they've been exposed. This is a demographic analysis. They've been exposed for longer to that type of actions by men, by their brothers. We're talking about a time, a lifetime. Mm-hmm. And what we have here from the survey is not that. It really is something different. Okay.
Good evening all. May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Enkhbayar. Actually, thank you very much Dr. Michael, Raymond, and Ms. Enkhbayar. It was really interesting. And I have one question. Yeah, one of the big problem is the victim blaming. Yeah, this is really common, and it's actually re-victimize the victims and prevent women to get the official support. So this attitude is very common among the service providers. And so my question is, what were activities that considering these issues, the projects you presented, or any other projects, and how were such activities evaluated? Because it's a very difficult. For me, it seems like very difficult to evaluate to this attitude and behavior and victim blaming attitude changes. Thank you. This is my question.
Michael, do you want to address that and explain what was done in El Salvador, if anything?
Okay, that's a very important question, and I before mentioning that, I just like to ask a very general question about the reliability of the information which is collected. I would imagine, for example, that among the older generations, they might be perhaps more reluctant to mention that they had suffered gender-based violence. Within a family, it would be very difficult for the grandmother perhaps to say that these things had happened to her. It's considered shameful and so on. So I think one of the really big challenges is knowing both how reliable the data is, what are the kind of things which people don't mention, but also the cultural changes. Because of the Me Too movement and a lot of the women's movements around the world, I think many younger women are much more open to discussing these issues. I know in the United States, there are many cases where the legal issues which are being brought up now by women are violations which took place 20 years ago, and they just say it was impossible for them before to bring up these issues, that they were so shameful. But now they feel that there's, when one person goes public and accuses of a well-known person, then other people feel that they have permission to do it. So I think it's very very difficult to understand both the reliability of the data, but also just cultural changes in how you think about gender-based violence. It could be that for the older generation, it was just accepted. I know I was working in Bangladesh, and there was two Canadian anthropologists, I forget their name, it was a long time ago, a man and a woman. They were living in the community, and somebody was renting a house to them, and when the owner of the house was showing them the house, she said, hope you'll be comfortable here. And then she said, on the door is a big stick so that your husband can beat you if you misbehave. And so in that culture, it was just accepted. Not everybody liked it, but it was accepted that, if a woman didn't behave properly, her husband had the right to physically punish her. And so that many women wouldn't report that as being among older generations as gender-based violence. This was something which is accepted, and some women may even say, well, I probably deserved it because of I wasn't respectful, or the meal was late when my husband came home. So it's just very, very difficult to come up with a framework for what kind of questions you ask, how you interpret them, what kind of things people can talk about, and so on. So I think that this is one of the very big challenges which we have to address. So I'll stop there and pass over to the two people who know Mongolia much better than I do.
Raymond, or
No, the social, I didn't get a chance to go into the details of what, you know, a socio-cultural understanding and education program could look at the end. But my question would be to our colleague is, how is this being addressed in the program, the national program? I mean, you know, she is central and senior in the program. How is that addressed specifically to be able to get police and service providers to understand that the issue is not one of women asking to be beaten, but more of the how tensions are resolved in the households?
тэгвэл Enkhbayar чи та хариулах уу? Enkhbayar сонсож байна уу? I guess she's busy with her father. Not responded.
I have actually some experience of working with the police officers and healthcare some service providers. Actually, sorry if I'm wrong. Maybe then Miss Mikhail or other people will correct me. And the regular, not the actual regular training at the provided to actually provide to police officers and service provided, but this is, I don't think this is a regular training. But while I'm delivering training, it was very common that the victim blaming was very common among the service provided, which is really pity. And I think the training is just the most, the more just about the not the just to tell them what is exactly gender or gender-based violence, and instead of just, for me, it's really important to change the attitude for a longer term. Also, in Mongolian cases, I think this the high turnover. Because of the high turnover, it's a really difficult problem. Yeah. So this is, I think this is the big issue still in Mongolia, to changing the behavior and attitude, knowledge of this service providers. Yeah.
And I would concur with that. It's not only specific to GBV, but it's specific for all the rest. As you probably all know, I've done a lot of training with RBM, and the problem with the training in management and results-based management is the fact that you train someone and 2 weeks later you go back to the administration and the person is gone. I mean, she's still alive, but she's gone. And so I would absolutely agree with you, is that if you are working on the basis of doing, small scale, specific, topic specific training, and you have people coming in, going out, coming in, going out, you're going into circles. And that's why, going back to the example I gave of the socio-cultural kind of improving understanding, improving education, working on both older generations of policemen, of social workers, etc., and parents, and working in the schools, it becomes very complex because some of the variables have to have a relative stability. You know, if you're going to teach a teacher, if you're going to train a teacher to understand GBV and the average length of time that teachers teach in schools is 2 years, you're just going to go into circles for the rest of, you know, for the rest of history. I mean, that's the big problem in Mongolia, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Maybe I could just make a brief comment about, we can discuss more in later seminars, but a very important methodology, I think, is participant observation, where the researcher is able to spend a lot of time in the community, in the household, observing what is happening. And one of the things which have been found in a lot of studies on issues relating to women's role in the family is that what women say is often quite different from their actual behavior, because there's a certain image of what should be the role of a man and a woman. And so often the woman will tell you what she thinks should be happening. To just give one brief example, a lot of studies are being conducted on the impacts of microcredit on women. And in Bangladesh, where a lot of these programs began, there were a number of anthropological studies where the anthropologists would spend a lot of time with the family over a period of 1 or 2 years, visiting them fairly frequently. And one of the, just to give one example of the problems of understanding women's role and behavior, one of the anthropologists was talking to the woman who participated in the microcredit program and was asking her in her house, somebody she knew quite well, she spent a lot of time there, who in your household, who makes decisions on, for example, buying books and uniforms for the children at school? And the woman said, it's my husband, you know, he makes those kind of decisions. And then the husband happened to arrive back from work, and he's said to his wife, what are those packages on the floor there? And his wife said, oh, those are the school books and the uniforms I went out and bought. And so the woman had just been telling the observer that it's a man who does these things. It's a man's role to decide how the money is spent. But she actually did it herself. And it's very complex to understand because she wasn't, I don't think, trying to lie. She didn't have any reason to say that she hadn't been involved, but she felt that her role was that it's the man who makes these decisions. And so you have to be very careful in how you interpret the information which you're given. And just one other example, which is even more dramatic. I was working in Angola at the end of the Civil War, and in many of the villages, the men hadn't been in the village for more than a year because they're either fighting with the rebels or they've been recruited by the army. And so the women had been saying, oh, you know, her husband hasn't been here for over a year and it's very difficult. He isn't able to send any money. And then we asked them, well, how do you decide what crops you're going to grow, what seeds you're going to buy, what fertilizers? And they said, it's our husband who makes those decisions. And so they had just told you that the husband hasn't been there for more than a year. But then when you ask, they say, oh, no, it's my husband who makes these decisions. And so, again, it's quite complicated. The woman is not, I don't think, intentionally trying to lie to you, but this is how in the traditional society who was supposed to be the man who earned the money and who made these decisions. And so some of the women, I think, felt it was sort of shameful to tell an outsider that the traditional society had broken down and it was now them who were making these decisions. They felt it was a kind of insult to their husband. And so it's, and if you get into these difficult issues of violence, it becomes even more complicated. So it really is a challenge to think what methods you can use to understand what happens if a woman comes to the police to register a complaint, or if there's a problem in the school. So you really do have to have a method where you can gain the confidence of not just a woman, but also the other members of the household. And it's obviously very difficult to do that on a large scale if you're trying to have a sample of the whole country. So I think trying to use mixed methods where you're combining surveys with some more in-depth observations to try to understand how people are interpreting things is, I think, a big challenge, but it's very important, and perhaps we'll get to discuss some of these issues in the later sessions.
Thank you. It's very interesting to me. Okay. So I think Raymond actually asked you the question, right? Last time. Okay, so if you have no further question or comment or feedback, we should end this session at the moment. And Raymond, do you have a question or a comment or something to say?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Well,
So-
it was great.
Okay. I just want to tell thank you for the speakers and the participants, and I really appreciate your time today. And you have been fantastic. And thank you so much for your contribution to the EMEA and learning session. And I hope you had great rest of the day. And see you again at our next learning session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And
Thank
bye
you so
for you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, have a
Yeah.
nice day.